Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. You're with Cameron Murray. As you know, I've released a new book, The Great Housing Hijack. This means I know how much effort goes into the production and distribution of content, but I never imagined the drama that might be involved in getting you this simple podcast interview about fairly ordinary housing policy questions. This interview today is with New Zealand economics commentator Bernard Hickey. What's unusual is that I'm not interviewing Bernard, he's interviewing me, alongside my consulting colleague Tim Helm, who is a Wellington-based economist who works for the think tank Prosper Australia. Bernard writes a popular Substack newsletter called the Kaka, named after a screechy New Zealand parrot which wakes up early and never seems to dial down the volume from hysterical levels. For many decades, this kaka was close to extinction, thanks in large part to the influence of Australians' possums. But nowadays, with an impenetrable fence being erected around a certain area of Wellington, and the rapid extermination of any unwelcome outsiders or predators, the local fledglings can grow up with total protection from anything that might come from beyond New Zealand's shores. So the kaka are back in New Zealand, and if you hear a few birds in the background, it's because this interview was recorded in the New Zealand summer in December 2023 at Tim's house, which I can confirm is in Wellington, while I was visiting there for a conference and to deliver a seminar at New Zealand Treasury. That's where the curious part of the story begins. Obviously, housing is a hot topic in New Zealand, as it is in Australia and many countries right now. The economics of how zoning rules relate to housing supply are the subject of much debate, as they are everywhere. In my innocence, I might not have realised quite how heated these issues were in New Zealand. Requiring councils to upzone has been the New Zealand government's main response to the housing cost problems they have experienced, many of those problems coinciding with record-breaking migration boom starting in 2014. Wellington in particular has been going through a rezoning process which has left a lot of locals quite anxious about these issues. I've written about this recently here at Fresh Economic Thinking, and there's a link in the show notes. Bernard too has admirably recorded and uploaded a number of conversations with some of the prominent voices in these debates. But oddly enough, our December interview disappeared into the ether. Despite dozens of emails, phone calls and texts, we never quite managed to find out why he decided not to post our interview to his Substack. Perhaps it was a simple matter of disorganisation. Perhaps the helicopter noise on the island where he lives had spoilt the quality. We're not sure. After the noise of Wellington's housing policy debate has died down, Bernard has found a spare minute to send us the audio file of this interview. Perhaps it contained ideas too dangerous to be released into the fragile, closed ecosystem of New Zealand politics. So I'm pleased to bring you this interview where Tim and I discuss lessons from Auckland's upzoning, land banking, the difference between zone density rules and market housing supply, and other topics. Please enjoy.
Cameron, could you tell us what you've been looking at in the New Zealand housing space, and in particular, what you think of this quite entrenched view backed by more than a couple of academic papers, that essentially the Auckland Unitary Plan has unleashed a flood of new supply into the Auckland housing market and helped effectively reduce prices and rents relative to other markets. What's your view of that thesis?
Well, I've been studying housing supply for more than 10 years, and so when Auckland did this plan, a quite substantial planning change, it was a great case study. So I tried to pay a lot of attention, and some of this early research came out, and it changed my view a little. I saw some research saying there were 20,000 extra dwellings over 5 years, which seemed like a lot considering that Auckland was only building 8,000 per year before that. So that's a squeezing sort of 7.5, 8 years worth of construction into 5 years. Seemed pretty substantial. And if that were true, it would be amazing. It would be a lesson for the world about how to make houses cheaper with no government budget cost and with surprisingly little political fallout. There is a huge tension, not just in Auckland, not just in New Zealand, not just in Australia, but globally or politically, because most people own their house and it's their biggest asset. And usually the top 20% of households are also landlords, and they like their asset going up and their rents going up. So this would have been a really great example for the world. And so it was actually Tim that started looking into some of this research. I saw it, did the sniff test. Gee, that seems like a lot. And eventually, I think we're probably the only two people on the planet who've actually replicated it, followed every equation to the end, and got all the data and found that some of the research claiming this massive increase in housing was just basically plotting the normal property cycle. So Auckland had a 2000s boom, then a big correction, just like they did in California, just like they did in Sydney, just like they did in Brisbane, and then it had a mid-2010s boom. And it just coincidentally happened to also have this planning change in the middle, which changed the composition of dwellings. So instead of more high-rises in the city and more detached houses on the fringe, the composition was changed. So there was a lot of townhouses and high-rises and single detached homes on the urban fringe. And so we looked at it and realized, well, if you just draw a straight line through the bottom of a curve that goes up and down, of course, when the curve goes back up, it looks like, you've had a huge construction boom. Now, it's true that there was a construction boom. It's hard to say that the plan caused it. And what we're actually seeing now is a large correction. Consents are falling off a cliff, just like they did in Sydney after their 2010s construction boom, and just like they did in California, and just like they did everywhere. And so I do wonder if people who have trusted that analysis will also concede that if these consents start falling, then that also too was caused by the unitary plan, because that's the only consistent way to interpret. So it is true that there was a boom, but I think it was a normal part of the cycle, and it's not clear that the research we've seen shows otherwise. And it is also true that rents were relatively flat in Auckland after that time, just like they were in Sydney, and just like they were in Brisbane, and just like they were in many other cities at the same part of the cycle. And what we're seeing now in 2023 is a bit of a reversion back to that normal cycle. So rents are rising faster than elsewhere, and new construction's falling. And it's quite interesting because we Australia, New Zealand, globally, we think we can just orchestrate more rapid housing construction with zoning. But then at the same time, we've got the central bank trying to stop people building houses by putting the interest rate up. So which is it, right? Do we want more houses or do we not want more houses? So these are the puzzles, that keep me awake. Literally last night, I was awake thinking, how do I explain this to people? And that's why I'm here in New Zealand. And Tim is my local expert that keeps me updated with all of the intricate political debates and planning decisions. So that's the story.
Yeah. So just intuitively, at least, the Auckland Unitary Plan appeared to make it easier to put more dwelling units on a particular plot of land than would otherwise have been the case. And for a lot of people who are driving around Auckland and looking certainly at the increase in the number of medium density type consents, it seemed intuitively to make sense that the zoning changes, absent other changes, did actually increase the total number of dwelling units, and that at least compared to other parts of New Zealand, rents did seem to fall relative, or not rise as fast, relative to other parts of New Zealand where there wasn't that reform.
That's true. I'll let Tim talk about the density versus composition question, but just to be clear that in the 2010s boom, the same thing happened. Rents fell in Auckland relative to elsewhere, and construction looked like it boomed relative to elsewhere. So I think if you don't have in mind that property goes in cycles in every city and extrapolate the last 3 years as if that's the indefinite future, then you're going to bump into these errors. But in terms of driving around and seeing the change, I think there is a density-quantity confusion.
Go for it, Tim.
Look, so for context, I guess the attribution of some economic change to a policy change is really difficult. So I should acknowledge from the outset, this is really, really challenging. It's a little bit like doing empirical macroeconomics. There's a lot of unobserved variables. There's reverse causalities. It's impossible to really just look at a correlation, for example, a correlation in time, and label that as causation. So this is a tricky job unpacking this. As for what people see on the ground and the experience of a developer who previously was limited to building, say, 2 stories, now they can build 6 stories, it just appears intuitively that that zoning constraint is binding. But the key point here is that the density you're allowed on a site, the number of dwellings you're allowed on a particular site, is not the same concept as the number of dwellings that the market supplies, that the development sector supplies. Because although a developer typically does build to the legal maximum on every site, typically not all feasible development opportunities are taken up. Not all sites that could be built on are actually built on. So you have the number of sites built on and the density to which they're built. And if you like, the product of those two things is the number of new houses you get. So when you see, it's great from the developer's perspective. If you own some land and suddenly you can build it higher, that's certainly excellent for your land values. But it's not necessarily the case that we're going to see more dwellings produced. And the number of, if you like, profitable development opportunities, what we call feasible capacity, in New Zealand relative to the rates of annual supply is huge. So Auckland had, even prior to the unitary plan, something like 30 years zoned capacity, some high proportion of that being feasible already, that means profitable to develop. Only a tiny fraction of that gets developed. So you have this paradox, if you like, that a rule that binds each and every site doesn't bind the market. So then you get into the tricky business of econometric inference to find out what that policy did. And if you like, we can certainly talk to the guts of the problem we saw in this really key paper that claimed to show an effect of that upzoning on the rate of housing supply. I guess another bit of context is that no one disagrees with the idea that planning, upzoning an area, moves around housing, right? I mean, you allow more townhouses and apartments, and you're going to get more of that and less of the other stuff. That's planning 101. The question of, I suppose, interest to economists and housing affordability people is whether upzoning per se can increase overall supply. That's the bit that's in real contention.
We have heard the Auckland Council regularly say, "Oh, look, we've got plenty of space for new homes," there's a whole bunch of people, actually some of whom have just got into government, who say, "No worries, we can solve this problem. We just need to build out." And we know that a lot of the upzoned, more intense housing does get politically difficult, as Chris Bishop discovered when he's supported the bipartisan medium-density residential standards proposal, which the new government has decided councils can opt out of. But also, intuitively, if you've got councils that are not allowing their cities to grow out because they don't want to spend all the money on the underground and overground horizontal infrastructure, and they're also stopping you from growing up, then shouldn't it be sensible, or at least intuitively a good idea, if you're not going out, to at least allow people to go up? And all other things staying the same, if you do upzone, at least you get some volume growth up, particularly when you've got councils that won't let you grow out.
Well, that's also not clear because going up costs more. So density increases in cost. So building a 40-story building costs more than twice as much as a 20-story building.
So tall buildings only make sense in the highest value locations. And so you can increase the planning limit, but the planning limit might be higher than what the market will limit density to be, because there's an optimal density regardless if there's no density limit. And so what you find is in a lot of cities, so I'm here in Wellington and people are saying, oh, we need more density, but I think a lot of the case here is it's just not economical to build what you want, the density you want. Simply, although it seems like apartments are expensive, do you know what's more expensive? Adding a 21st story on a 20-story building, adding the extra, earthquake requirements, the extra basement, the extra concrete. The marginal cost of going up is very high. I mean, that's why we don't have super tall buildings except in the most high value locations. So you can allow it. It doesn't mean the market will do it. And I think the other response to that, Bernard, is that I think you're almost sort of having in mind that there's this binding constraint that councils have literally drawn a line across all the dwellings that are there and we have to let them. But the reality is totally different to that. It's actually the capacity to develop across many sites is so big relative to how much gets built per year. So I think, like in Queensland, for example, we have 500,000 sites for detached houses only, excluding apartments, right? And we only build something like 14,000 a year, right? And some years we build 7,000 and some years we build 30. And so whether that 500,000 is 750,000 or 1 million, and even that number is pretty fuzzy, right? Because you can always get approved outside of the plan if you make a good argument through the planning process. So it's not always clear to me that allowing equals getting, because there's a market constraint as well as a planning constraint on every site.
And I'll just add one point, Bernard, for your listeners. There's a sort of dirty L word that we don't use very much, and it's land bank, and it's got some pejorative meanings. But I sort of think about this as just a site that is already profitable to develop. You can knock down what's on there, develop it to typically the legal maximum, and you've added value. You can turn a profit doing that. Now, the number of sites that are in that state but not being developed is large. So there's an awful lot of land banking. So that sort of premise in your question that it's currently illegal to build up beyond what we already have is just on the numbers. It's wrong. It's just we have a lot of sites sitting in low intensity use that are feasible to develop to higher intensity use, and they're not being developed because really there's something of a built-in speed limit into how fast developers actually want to supply new housing. It's not necessarily in their interest to crash that price.
So that's an interesting point then. What you're saying is that, Economics 101 suggests if there is a very, very high price, that supply will magically be sucked in to help offset that high price and drag the price down. And intuitively, it seems to make sense. And if you have an enormous amount of unbuilt, supply that could be built, on the face of it, it feels like, well, surely the developers will compete against each other. They'll throw new supply into the market, and we'll have a supply response to the high price, and away we go. But what's stopping all these people who own this land from making a profit and sticking a whole bunch of homes on it?
Well, let me talk you through that. They own the land, an undeveloped site, because they don't want cash. If they wanted cash, they wouldn't own a development site, right? So when they develop it and sell it, they get cash back, right? So this is part of their portfolio of investments. And an undeveloped site is an asset, and it makes a return. It goes up in value if the price of houses go up, even if you don't build homes. So we've got to understand that we're not in a sort of production economy where we have to farm and we have to harvest to get cash flow. Otherwise, the farm's worth nothing because the apples rot on the tree or whatever. We are in a sort of asset economy where an undeveloped site is a good investment as an undeveloped site, and keeping it that way gets a return. And so only at this perfect moment where the demand conditions are right, will you make that asset swap from cash plus undeveloped site into new housing, because you use the cash for construction, you take the undeveloped site and you add it with the cash, and then you get a different return on that. So I think there is this idea of competition that, owners of undeveloped site, they're desperate to get money. They have to build to get money. I'm like, no. They don't want money. That's why they own undeveloped sites, because if they wanted money, they wouldn't have bought it, right? They're in the portfolio management business. And I think when you change your lens to see that, a lot of stuff starts making sense. And my friends who are property traders and property developers, they totally understand that owning undeveloped sites for 15 or 20 years is a great investment when there's a lot of development nearby or new infrastructure going in. They know, and they wait for the right time.
So surely, though, the people who own this land have borrowed money to buy it and have cash costs that they need to offset. So why would they keep holding on to it?
I mean, that's just a portfolio management question, right? So you own some land, you own some shares, you have some debts. I mean, at the end of the day, you're just risk managing the total portfolio. It's not the case that most property owners are highly leveraged. It's the case that last year's first property buyers are highly leveraged. Most property owners are completely not, right? It's just, and especially large sites, former industrial sites, all these sort of things, they might be owned by large institutions that their balance sheets are massive and this is a tiny part, and they're just sort of managing this as one amongst many sites. And they're trying not to sort of undermine themselves. Like, that's why we stage new projects, right? Because I don't want to flood the market with stage one, because I've got to sell stage two, right? I'm in the asset management business here. It's just like when I sell shares, right? If I'm a large shareholder in a company, I don't just tell the broker, sell it all today. Doesn't matter what price we get. You go, if the buyers aren't there, I'll have to drip it out over the next couple of months and sell it in dribs and drabs, because it's a sort of asset management decision.
But if you were managing shares or other types of assets where there was a realistic prospect of the price going down for a long time, and you took a view there was a fundamental, the price was fundamentally too high for the earning capacity of those shares, and that there was a risk that if you didn't sell now, you'd be selling later, and in effect, you would be losing out. So why don't landowners worry about collapses of prices and being caught holding the baby?
Well, they do. In 2008, in the United States and Spain, they all decided we better be the first one out, and they all panic sold, and we get a property market crash. That's like a disequilibrium situation, right?
And regarding, I suppose, the effect of what upzoning can do on housing prices and land, well, presumably these landowners are smart, and if they thought there was any credible prospect that something like the Auckland Unitary Plan would trigger such a rush of new housing that it would devalue the value of their land, well, presumably they've done that already, but we didn't see that after the Unitary Plan. Land went up. Now, the more ripe your land was for development, the crappier the house that was on there, the more your land went up. But a lot of land went up, and that signals, if you like, that all the smart money, let's assume they're smart, all the smart money didn't think there was any prospect that upzoning could trigger a building boom and a rush to the door by owners of existing land that would see all land devalue. I'll just add another couple of points, Bernard. So you asked earlier, what is stopping someone with a rotten old car park that they can build to a 6-story apartment? What's stopping them doing it today? And I guess the key here is it's the option value that they're losing in developing that site. This is where land development is different to producing cars or whatever else. You produce 1,000 cars this year. You can produce 1,000 cars tomorrow. But if you produce 100 dwellings on your site this year, you can't produce 100 dwellings on that site tomorrow.
Or 200 tomorrow if conditions change.
If, for example, if zoning changes, produce tomorrow. Exactly. And you're faced also with this point that if you want to expand your own rate of supply, then you've got to lower your price expectations if you want to sell those today, and you're going to have to bid those construction resources off somebody else. Try getting a tradie in 2021 and try telling me that planning rules were slowing down the rate of housing supply in 2021. I mean, tradies wouldn't even pick up the phone, right? So we're in the situation where you're going to have to pay over the odds for construction, and you're going to have to accept under your expectations to sell a house if you're going to dump a bit more onto the market, if you're going to build a bit more and dump a bit more onto the market. So these considerations just set up if you like, a market rate of new supply. Cameron calls it the market absorption rate. And I like to just think about it as, planners regulate the density to which you can build, and the market regulates the rate at which new houses arrive per year. It's not planners regulating. There's nothing in the rule book that says you can only supply 15,000 houses a year in Auckland or 1,000 in Wellington City. That's just market forces, and the rules are a long way from constraining those market forces.
And we do see during a boom those rates go up by 5-10 times in certain key areas. You'll see new fringe subdivisions selling one a month, and then there's a boom and they say 12 or 15 for a few months. So the question was, well, why didn't you sell 12 or 15 a month right from the start? And these are the considerations.
So just then looking more broadly at the issue, you're saying that there isn't necessarily a connection between upzoning and any sort of lower price inflation or lower prices or lower rent inflation or lower rents. So what's your view then of upzoning as one of the tools in the toolkit? It seems to be the one a lot of people are going for at the moment, perhaps because they haven't been able to change other things. But what's your view about upzoning? Because intuitively it seems like a good idea to allow more people to build more homes wherever they want, in what format they want.
So I think there's a couple of considerations. I guess, firstly, you need to think about zoning as an urban planning tool, not a house price lever. You can help direct where different types of development go, and you can coordinate where it goes with public investments in infrastructure. And I think that's what it's really good for. The second thing I think is, yes, upzoning is often good because plans are often very outdated and not reflective of current tastes and technologies in construction. But in cases where that limit was binding much below what the market optimal density would be, what you're doing is sort of giving away air rights for free to the existing property owners. So people think of land as like a chessboard that we sort of carve up, and each player can go as high as they want on each square. But we actually carve it up more like a Rubik's Cube. It's like little cubes around planet Earth. And so what you're doing is you're giving the next layer of the cube for free to the person who owns the air underneath it. And so you can price that. And so I think if you're going to be in the business of upzoning...
But isn't that how you make money, by getting a right for free and monetizing it? That's the history of
I mean, that's why
colonialist capitalism. But anyway.
Well, that's why there's some really interesting allies that property developers want upzoning, and they want prices to go up, and so do the sort of left in politics, and they want house prices to go down. So there's a little bit of a strange bedfellow situation there. So in the ACT, they charge 75% of the market price of additional rights to increase density. In Sydney in the 1970s, for 4 years, for one electoral cycle, they charged 30% of that value. In Sao Paulo in Brazil, they have monthly auctions. So you have a particular density right, and to go above that, you buy the air rights from the community. So these are all possible. And I think if you're in the business of upzoning, it's also worth understanding that you are manipulating who owns the air rights and their value in the community. So you should be pricing that, I think, to do it in a fair way. And I think at the end of the day, just remember, it's not a house price tool. It's a geographic or location regulation, and we can certainly argue about what's an efficient city and what's efficient transport. But I don't think it's a good tool for making houses cheaper, and that's the sort of big mistake, I think, at the heart of the debate.
Great. So, I'd just add one more thing, Bernard, which is getting to the local policy context, is that this is a easy source of income to tax, and tax very fairly. I mean, there's no fairness case that you get a windfall because your land happened to be in a well-located area and you got some new rights for free. And we have these problems right now in New Zealand of councils crying poor for funds, asking for a cut of GST or just other money from the central government to pay for infrastructure. And you have this ready-made fair pool of money, which is the value of the zoning rights we give, that could be used, could be socialized, captured, socialized, used to pay for the infrastructure that serves that land that's now being developed to a more intense use. So this is a really natural and fair way to be funding infrastructure. And it's slightly maddening that it's not more central to the conversation. It's a real elephant in the room. I know the Productivity Commission in New Zealand recommended this, and it's just sat dormant, that recommendation, to give councils a value capture lever.
Or maybe that's why they got wiped out, is that they were rude enough to suggest that the owners of property rights should pay a tax that would share some of that gain and value created by public investment. By the by, what's the solution then to trying to make our homes more affordable? And I'm assuming that you both think that they perhaps should be.
So I think if you take another step back and think about the politics, if you were to effectively enact a policy that somehow manipulated the market rent and the market price substantially downwards and could sustain it, and I'm not saying it's easy or possible, you'd be gone politically, because the vast majority of property owners, you've just wiped them out, right? The vast majority of your voters are landowners. And so if I've mused over this question for a long time, and I looked around the world, and to be clear, I think it's important from time to time to put your head up and look around and go. In Germany, they're protesting on the streets and want the government to nationalize corporate landlord buildings. You can look in Canada, and it's similarly intense, the debate. Across some parts of the US, it's the same. In the UK and in Australia, it's very hard to find a place that's not having these arguments. The places and points in history where we look to and go, oh, actually, housing was cheap then, are those places where we had major non-market housing options for people. Just like we make roads cheap by not having a fully private road system, a road monopoly, and then complaining, oh, can't we upzone the road owners so they can put more lanes and make driving cheap? Or we go, oh, we'll just socialize that. If you need to drive, you drive at a cheap regulated price, which is basically zero to use the street. And in schools, we do similar things, and in hospitals, and I just don't see why we can't do it in housing. And if we look to Australia's history, the way we got high home ownership and cheap housing was we had massive, massive public investment in subsidised home ownership for 20 years. The way Finland got it in Helsinki was the same. In post-war reconstruction, the way Vienna gets it. I think they have 220,000 social homes and regulated prices. And if we look around the world, these non-market options are how residents get cheap, stable housing. And to be clear, the private market works for a lot of people. Like, most people are homeowners. So I think if you're in the political business of manipulating the market with changes in policy or tax, you are just picking fights unnecessarily when you can create a non-market option relatively cheaply. I mean, for example, the Land and Housing Corporation in New South Wales is the public housing provider. The value of the stock of housing they own went from $34 billion in 2012 to $54 billion in 2019. They literally made $20 billion in 7 years. And everyone complains about how expensive it is to build public housing. I'm like, well, it's not. It's a great investment. We should just do it. And I think if we're not thinking along those lines, we're sort of backed ourselves into a sort of theoretical, ideological corner.
So just to bring Tim into the conversation, so one option is lots of public house building. What are other options to deal with these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. I think I'd like to see the housing affordability question get reframed straight away, right at the start. So we talk about housing affordability, and then we talk as if changing housing costs is the only solution to make housing more affordable. Now, building public housing can change housing costs, and you can, of course, direct that to the needy people. But housing affordability is this equation of two parts, right? It's the housing costs, what's the rent, or what does it cost to serve the mortgage, and it's your income, it's your purchasing power. And there's a sense in the zeitgeist that somehow the price of housing, the cost that people must pay to live, is not right, and we need to just tackle that and that and that. And I sort of look at this differently and think, well, don't we just have a problem of inadequate purchasing power? If we're talking about those at the bottom not being able to afford enough housing, if we're talking about those people not being able to afford enough to a petrol for their car, we don't sort of blame the structure of petrol regulation. We just take that this is the cost of providing petrol at the service station in New Zealand. Now, with housing, somehow we think that the supply side has gone all wrong and the prices are not what they should be. And that's, it's another story, but it's based on some sort of, in my view, dubious theories of what the prices could be. But I think we need to just come back to the role of income inequality and income poverty. Now, if you take the poorest people in New Zealand, or even take a minimum wage earner, I worked this one out the other day, what we consider an affordable share of their income is normally around 30%. Now, 30% of a full-time minimum wage in New Zealand cannot finance, can barely finance the construction costs alone on the cheapest house you can imagine. It couldn't finance a land purchase. So it's simply impossible with that kind of income to fund construction of a home, let alone acquire a little bit of land. So I sort of see it as that if those in lower incomes cannot afford adequate, dignified housing, then this is because they're being outbid for these scarce construction sector resources and scarce, well-located land by those with higher incomes. So I don't think we have a housing crisis. I think we have an inequality crisis in Australia and New Zealand that's manifest in housing, as it is in other areas, but housing's so significant. So I just think, why are we not supplementing incomes of those who we deem in housing need?
Isn't that what we already do with accommodation supplements, at least for rents?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do it more.
Yeah, I think that works. And I think
it's partly, I'll add one more thing, is that the nature of land is that inherently it's about inequality, not the level of income, right? So a city is, some people describe a city as a tournament economy. You've got to be one of the best or the highest earning X number of people to be able to live there, to live in Monaco or London. Now, in a sense, it's not the absolute level of income of those at the bottom that matters when it comes to acquiring a share of well-located land, but it's their relative income. So actually inequality per se, rather than just the income. So proposals such as Susan St. John and Terry Boucher's idea that, for example, real estate wealth over a certain level is taxed, partly to address inequality, but partly to, if you like, redirect construction sector resources and land towards lower-end housing, skew the housing market. Those are interesting proposals in my mind, because they get to the core of the problem, which is that we just have levels of inequality that mean the poor cannot afford to acquire adequate housing.
Just finally, what's your view then on a broad-based, low-rate, residential zoned land value tax to collect some of that wealth and reuse it to invest in public housing or transport, those sorts of things?
I think before we all furiously agree here, because I think we will, I'm just predicting, I just want to, again, lift our head up a bit, and let me quote you from Charles Darwin, the biologist, in 1836, when he landed in Sydney on the HMS Beagle, and the diary entry from the first paragraph of his first day. And I'll quote, "The number of large houses just finished and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." End. So what are we talking here? Nearly 200 years ago in Sydney?
It's a permanent crisis.
Population of Sydney, 19,000. I don't really know if it's modern planning regulations that we should be pointing to. Don't know about taxes. I don't know if there are any taxes in 1836. So I just wanted to sneak that in on you. Yeah. But the land tax question is, of course, it's the fairest tax there is, and we can do it at a low rate. And I don't know how it works in New Zealand, but councils in Australia already raise their revenue from rates, which are taxed on the land value. And so there's a great tool there already for councils to fund themselves more by land taxes if they need to fund infrastructure, and for the state as well.
And the part I'd add is that Yes, in principle, but we need to. Of course, I have to say this. I'm working for a George's think tanks, and this is the most efficient and fair tax we can think of as a long-term base. But people's houses and homes are a store of a huge amount of asset wealth, and the pace at which we do this and the transition measures are going to be important. And there's actually other land windfalls, particularly that from upzoning, that, if you like, are a fairer candidate for capturing immediately and quickly. Having said that, restructuring the economy towards a greater reliance on land taxation generally is, and away from taxing distorting activities. I mean, this is the madness, right? We penalise people for going to work, and we, as you're well aware, Bernard, and we reward them, if you like, with tax-free capital gains when they lobby to have their site built to a level that wasn't in the zoning scheme.
So the ACT, Canberra, has been transitioning to a land tax for a decade now, and it's quite substantial. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that this doesn't necessarily make it easier for a new home buyer to buy or a renter to buy. What it does is sort of redirect some of the cost of becoming a homeowner from a mortgage, for example, to the government as a tax. As a tax proposal, I love it. I've been supporting it for years. Does it make houses substantially cheaper for people who don't own houses? Probably not really. And I think I support doing that much more directly.
Thank you very much to both of you for coming on to the Kaka to talk about the stuff we can't help ourselves talking about on the Kaka, which is always about housing.